From the CISO Series, it's Cybersecurity Headlines.
Internet-wide zero-day bug fuels largest ever DDoS attack. 23andMe resets user passwords after genetic data is posted online. And network open source tool Curl faced the worst security flaw in a long time. Or did it? These are some of the stories that my colleagues and I have been bringing to you on this week's cybersecurity headlines. And now we get a chance for some insight, some opinion, and definitely some expertise on these stories and more from our guest, Martin Choluj, the VP of Security at ClickHouse. Martin, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, before we move on to the conversation, we of course have to thank our sponsor for today, Hyperproof. Know your risks, monitor your risks, mitigate your risks. Remember, you can join us on YouTube to watch us live. Go to CISOSeries.com to do so. Look for the events dropdown and click on the cybersecurity headlines week in review image. Just click on it. You're joining us and you'll be chatting with us. That's what we like to see. All of your comments showing up in our chat. It's always awesome to see. We will try and address some of those during the course of the show, but let's keep the conversation going. We see some of our regulars there in the chat, so always good to hear. We've got about 20 minutes, though, so let's get started. First up here, internet-wide zero-day bug fuels the largest ever DDoS attack. A record-breaking DDoS attack dubbed HTTP2 Rapid Reset occurred on August 28th and 29th, with Google recording a peak of 398 million requests per second, which, if you'll note for the record, is a lot, 7.5 times, in fact, larger than any previous attack against its resources. Google, along with AWS and Cloudflare, partnered with DDoS security and infrastructure vendors to minimize the effects of the attacks, doing things like you would expect, load balancing and focusing on the edge. The exploited protocol, HTTP2, enables browsers to quickly view website images and text, and the protocol is used by roughly 60% of all web apps. Many organizations will remain exposed to the attack until they patch their HTTP2 instances. So, Martin, this protocol was ostensibly designed as an improvement over HTTP 1.1 with, among other things like faster load speed. Does a DDoS attack like this cause concern with you that it may be followed by more of the same, or is this just part and parcel with the internet protocol business?
Yeah, I think this is probably one of the more interesting stories that came out this week for a number of reasons. Some of you might have noticed that I think this is the first time when we've switched reporting on denial of service attacks from sort of layer 3 and layer 4 volumetric numbers. We used to see in gigabits per second type information, and when it comes to previous attacks, we're seeing requests per second. So there's definitely I think something quite interesting with this particular attack. And so we're seeing some significant numbers. 400 million requests per second is not a small number, like you mentioned, 7.5 times the previous biggest one that we have seen. What is interesting about this one is that HTTP2 has been designed predominantly to adopt our sort of digital infrastructure to cater to the increased usage of that infrastructure out there. So a lot of the focus and effort in bringing HTTP2 to the market as far as protocol definition has been focused on exactly on that. Can we load websites faster? Can we streamline the process of client-server interactions? And what is interesting about that specific attack is that there has actually been some early reports and research done this going back as far as 2016, so very shortly after HTTP2 came out. And those reports were suggesting that the exact features that HTTP2 brought to the table are also the features that people can see being abused. And I think there were some proof of concepts and some research papers published by Imperva back then that actually identified some multiplexing and streaming related issues that were already highlighted back then. So what is interesting to me is that it has taken us 7 years to get there, because we've seen early reports of folks talking about this and looking at that. What is also interesting is that we are moving kind of up the layer when it comes to attacks here. We're no longer seeing attacks that target layer 3 and layer 4. Which is good and bad. The good is that perhaps if a neighbor in the same data center is subject to an attack, you'll be less likely affected by this because that attack has moved up to the stack to the application layer. However, the bad is that there's, while we have the patches released, there's still patching that needs to be done. People actually have to go out and patch the relevant web servers. And even on top of that, I think we're going to see some incremental attempts at using that feature, because that feature is not going away. It's part of the HTTP2 stack. Streams and multiplexing is very much what is the kind of the core feature of HTTP2. So I do expect to see more here.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the perspective of kind of this change in the scope or the level of attack, literally the level of attack for a DDoS of this scale, and definitely something that's raising some awareness because James Driscoll in our chat said I had never heard of HTTP2 until this week. So hey, you're learning stuff every day. We aim to help you out, James. So. Good stuff, and we'll definitely keep monitoring if we see more of trends of DDoSes on the scale for sure. Next up here, 23andMe reset user passwords after genetic data was posted online. The DNA testing company made the headlines this week after revealing that data on millions of its members had been stolen, despite the company's assurances there had been no incident. Soon after, they made suggestions that members reset their passwords out of caution. According to 23andMe, the data was compiled from users that had opted into a feature to automatically share their data with others. Theoretically, this would allow a hacker to access more than one victim's account for every account that they broke into. So, based on 23andMe's customer documentation, it appears that the feature is based on explicit opt in. Why would a company like 23andMe, I guess, not do more to proactively protect their user accounts, Martin?
Yeah, I think this story is a great example of how some of those conversations actually happen internally. I have spent nearly 10 years in B2B space and kind of have been in that space for a while. And so I can kind of speak from experience about how those conversations typically go. As a security team, if you do have a good relationship with your product and your business teams, you might be brought into a conversation about new features and new functionality being released to the market. That would be a good use case where you actually get introduced to those conversations and you can have your say, you can have your discussion, you can bring in your concerns and risks when it comes to bringing a feature like this to the market. In other situations, you might be just kind of brought in to just assess the implementation of a feature, in which case you may not even have a say in what gets released. But I think this story kind of shows that ongoing tension and friction that is needed, but one where security perhaps in this specific conversation maybe didn't have as big of a voice as it needed to have. To me, I think the feature itself doesn't necessarily present a significant risk, but I think what does present a challenge here is the fact that having that feature enabled, having that feature released in the first place, have many dependencies on other security protocols and controls that exist when it comes to account security. And perhaps when you have those at a level that allows abuse and allows for things to go wrong, this is where I think that whole case for 23andMe went wrong. There's been a little bit of commentary online about whether 23andMe has done enough to protect user accounts. Whose responsibility is it? Is it the user responsibility to own the ownership of the quality of passwords that you use versus the company providing it? There's different perspectives on this. I think historically we've looked at this as an industry as as part of a shared responsibility model, as something that ultimately the user owns, because companies don't control the passwords that you choose. But at the same time, I do think that we're moving into an area, have been moving into an area where companies simply just need to do more. You can't just say that this is a user's problem. You have to do more. You have to do more in terms of detection, and you have to do more in terms of providing the right prompts, offer the right capabilities when it comes to account security features. I think that's kind of the takeaway from here. But I do feel like we're just not doing enough in this space. We're still very much expecting users to carry the burden of that challenge.
Yeah, never a good move when your part of your response is throwing stuff at the feet of yours. I don't even want to say blaming, but saying like, well, that was a part of it. It's like, well, you designed that system also. So yeah, for sure.
That's right.
Next up here, network protocol open source tool Curl faces the worst security flaw in a long time. Or did it? Curl is an open source tool that supports network protocols. You know the deal: SSL, HTTP, SMTP. You know Curl. An advisory from GitHub published Wednesday of last week announced fixes for a high severity vulnerability tracked as CVE 2023-38545, rolls off the tongue, and that it's been released on October 11th. It was described as probably the worst curl security flaw in a long time, but it turned out to not be as bad as predicted. So, Martin, some high profile experts suggested organizations take precautions, and we are, of course, in the business of taking precaution, but is it damaging, I guess, to the collective reputation of security specialists when a warning of this type seems to be falling flat?
I think a simple answer is yes. I think it is. It is one of those situations where we've kind of scored our own goal here as a security industry. We've created hype around something that turned out to be less of a hype and less of a concern. And I think the damage here is really on security teams, as in as part of your security operations program, you have a vulnerability management program in place. You have a patch management program in place. You have a certain pace at which you look at vulnerabilities in your environment. Whenever something kind of gets out of that cycle, there is some sort of a hype, some news coming out, you kind of change the patterns for security teams. They have to stop what they're doing. They have to assess this other thing that is being reported. People are being distracted. Colleagues and business leaders and partners and customers start kind of flooding in with questions and requests for information, especially if you're in the sort of in the B2B space. And that is distracting. That changes the flow of security teams. So I would love for our industry to do better at basically really picking and choosing the ones that we really need to pay attention to and take care of. And maybe this is the worst sort of vulnerability for curl, but in the larger scheme of things, in the larger sort of attack surface that most companies deal with, this has been a non-event. If you look at sort of what needs to be true for this vulnerability to be exploitable, there's several conditions. You have to be running a specific version of curl, lib curl. You also have to be using a specific feature. You have to be using the proxy feature. Then you have to configure in a certain way. And even if you get all of those things right, the impact is still questionable. There's a proof of concept on GitHub with somebody managing to crash the lib service, but yes, there's potential maybe for some remote code execution eventually if somebody could figure this out. But it certainly hasn't reached that level of, I guess, urgency across my team, across other teams that I have been speaking to when it comes to remediation. But it has disrupted that flow. So to me, that is the challenge. That is the damage here.
Yeah, it seems like in the last 2 months, I have heard more conversations about, the not just about like the whole CVE system, but just the idea of, you have to have context to really understand the severity of any of these vulnerabilities and the patches, and it's never a one size fits all situation. CCL in the chat said the good thing about this was people taking inventory of curl and lib curl used in their environment and be ready to patch if impacted. That hey, a little visibility, never a bad thing. Great point, CCL. Next up here, the SEC investigates Move It. Progress Software has disclosed through a regulatory filing that the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission has opened an investigation into the rash of troubles caused from vulnerabilities in its Move It managed file transfer product. If you've listened to cybersecurity headlines, we have been covering all of the fallout from that. In the filing, Progress said costs related to the vulnerability amounted to about $1 million. That does include payout from cyber insurance, so $1 million on top of that, but said losses could mount after 23 customers launched legal action against it, as well as the 58 class action lawsuits filed by individuals, which I can only imagine will go north. So Martin, an SEC investigation is no surprise, but $1 million, at least to me, seemed a little low for a series of events that had the same kind of, I don't know, cascading terror that, we were kind of looking at SolarWinds too. I mean, like, it's in terms of like seeing the impact across a wide variety of organizations, especially since there's a queue of 58 class action lawsuits right outside their door. I'm curious, what's your take?
Yeah, so I think, look, those numbers do look low. I agree with you. They look very low, in fact. And I think they look low because the numbers we're looking at are purely the figures that the company has provided to really kind of articulate the cost of responding to the breach as far as, I guess, technical investigation, the different consulting firms and managed service providers that they had to bring in to help investigate and remediate that issue. And so I actually had a look at another disclosure, another AKA report that was released in, I believe, November, December last year. And they also talked about another issue that they suffered. And they also mentioned some numbers. And those numbers were already higher than this issue, and that they did not have a customer impact, at least as claimed by this company. And so I do feel like those numbers are low, but they're low because they don't perhaps include the legal costs that the company is going to be facing and potential other costs associated with the lawsuits that we discuss here, and those can be quite significant. That also kind of brings into question how we think about the cost of breaches and what we should be reporting as a cost of breaches. We have a number of institutions out there and research firms that do that kind of work that try to quantify this. But certainly, if we look at over 1,000 customers affected, from what I understood, over 60 million records affected, if we apply some of the numbers that we see from IBM and others, we're looking at billions of dollars, but that somehow doesn't translate into what we're seeing here in this report. So I think more to come on this story.
Most definitely, for sure. And we will be covering it on Cybersecurity Headlines. So make sure you're staying up to date. Now, before we move on to our next story, we have to spend a few moments with our sponsor for today, Hyperproof. Are you struggling to showcase the value of your work? It's a classic challenge in the risk and compliance space. Leadership just doesn't understand what exactly you do and why it matters. With Hyperproof, the leading risk and compliance management platform, you get access to real-time reports that can help your leadership team understand the impact of the valuable work you do every day. Get a demo at hyperproof.io. 404 Pages Hijacked. This was my gold star story of the week. Researchers at Akamai spotted this new campaign by the threat actors behind the MageCart payment skimmer. The threat actors effectively hide JavaScript code in a comment on a site's 404 page. And to get you to there, they create a modification on other site pages to call on a non-existent folder, which you guess takes you to the 404. While this is quite creative, researchers did note that a call to a non-existent folder marks this as a much more noisy attack approach than what we typically see out of MageCart, which likes to try and, be more on the DL, I guess. So, Martin, this is somewhat reminiscent of, P.T. Barnum's favorite sign, "This way to the egress," and that duped fairground patrons to walk through an exit and then have to pay to get back in. At least these people are actively trying to be malicious. Do you see this as a clever move by the skimmer people, or I guess, maybe a little bit clumsy, tipping their hand a little bit?
I think this story shows creativity that is present out there with folks that are trying to take advantage of online businesses and online systems. They go back several years. They have tried different things in the past, and all of them were to an extent creative. I mean, they've tried doing different things with CSS styles. They've tried exporting clear information out of image tags. So I just see this as a sort of expansion of their toolkit, and not exactly surprised that they're trying different things. It is creative. I see this as we see creativity on the side, on the other side of the table. It is what's interesting about this one is that very rare. Sometimes we just don't see correlation between what's happening in the industry as far as attack vectors, especially in that space, and compliance. And I've worked with the PCI DSS space for several years now, and I've seen that really catching up. And one of the key things, if you're not doing today, a bit of sort of a takeaway from that conversation, is that there is some new changes coming up in PCI version 4. They're not effective until 2025, but I strongly advise our listeners to really spend some time on this. If you do take payments on your website, you should really be thinking about some of the improvements and changes that are being suggested in version 4. One of the key ones is really about paying significant attention to your payment pages and sort of new scripts and changes to those payment pages. And version 4 introduces this requirement when you should be checking your payment pages every week for new scripts. And that is really, this is a direct correlation between what we're discussing here and the compliance industry trying to kind of catch up to this problem. If you're not, I suggest not to wait until 2025. Do it today. It could be just as simple as just hashing that file and whenever it changes, paying attention to those changes, because we can see that there will be more creative ways of people trying to skim credit cards out of websites. It is still one of the most profitable part of the underground cybercrime.
Yeah, the cat and mouse in that particular area is moving real fast. So yeah, don't wait for compliance. Listen, compliance is great. Don't wait on it for sure. Next up here, Clorox warns of cyber attack costs. Kind of another story dealing with the long-term impacts of a cyber attack. Clorox says it's spent $25 million so far in its response to its August cyber attack, but foresees additional costs and product shortages to come. Representatives from the company said in a statement that sales will tumble between 23 and 28% for the quarter ending September 30th, and that it will post a loss in the quarter instead of a projected nearly $150 million profit that investors had expected. This statement from the company, posting a loss rather than expected profit for shareholders, shines a light on that other casualty of cybercrime, investors' money. Could such announcements be, I guess, a necessary shockwave we need to adequately fund maybe proactive defenses? I mean, if we're talking about an over $150 million swing, if Moody's or S&P downgrades the company, that takes a lot of luster off of Burt's Bees, is all I'm saying. Losing investor money, it's not something you can throw 2 years of credit monitoring at, I guess. Martin, I'm curious your thoughts.
Yes, this one is another interesting story for me for this week, because it really shows that I think the way we think about the impact on shareholder value when it comes to security incidents can be quite different depending on the industry. And using Clorox as an example, if you manufacturing physical goods and you cannot manufacture those physical goods, the bottom line impact is quite instant and quite significant potentially, as we see this with those numbers. So if you're in that space, I think this is probably one of those moments that if you're not spending time and money thinking about your cybersecurity exposure and risks, you should. At the same time, I do think that, you mentioned S&Ps and Moody's credit rating agencies. At the end of the day, those agencies have their models, and they ultimately are responsible for ensuring that investors have up-to-date information on sort of creditworthiness and kind of the financial health of the business. And I think what we're seeing, those numbers are basically directly impacting the bottom line of the company as far as the revenue that they're bringing to the table. So it won't surprise me if there's going to be some impact on that front. I don't know exactly how S&P and Moody performs their due diligence and how often they do that, but I can see this being a material impact to their bottom line. So we will be seeing probably some changes when it comes to that.
In our chat here, Richard Rushing said 100 million is the minimum if you have to shut down operations of a global company. And I was thinking about this, especially for Clorox, which is effectively a commodity. They're selling a commodity. Their value is their brand. So if you need Clorox products, there are other things in them. It's not like, I was thinking about this compared to like automotive, right? Where there's more of a, if you really want that Toyota, you'll wait for the Toyota. But if you need bleach, there's a lot of bleach out there, is all I'm saying.
You didn't know.
So it's just interesting how different industries are affected by this, much more severely, for sure. All right, and our last story of today, Microsoft to kill off VB script in Windows to block malware delivery, pouring some out for poor VB script. After 27 years of use, Microsoft is planning to phase out Visual Basic Script in future Windows releases. Of course, it was introduced in a sunnier time, August 1996, and was bundled with Internet Explorer, perhaps cursed since launch. Since then, malicious actors have used VB script to distribute malware, including strains like Emotet and Qbot, getting on the whole botnet business. So, Martin, Microsoft has taken measures to curb attacks on VBA macros and disabled VB script by default in in Internet Explorer 11 on Windows 10. Definitely covered that on the show when those things were happening. Sadly, this is VB script's old yeller moment. Do you feel this is a wise move, or I guess, will Microsoft users suffer from its sunsetting? Who's going to feel the loss here?
I suspect that this was a move that Microsoft has been planning for a while. If you kind of trace back some of the announcements and decisions that they have made over the years, I think this was sort of coming. Is it going to cause pain? I think so. There are many businesses that have built a lot of their business operations and reporting and data analytics based on Visual Basic scripts. But I think it's a necessary move, and I think one that Microsoft has been preparing for some time. I do hope that this is not one of those sort of Windows 7 moments where the extended supports will last for years, and we'll continue to see Microsoft supporting this technology for years to come. Interesting enough, Microsoft also released in August this year officially support for Python in Excel, but the way they've orchestrated the Python support features is quite different. It runs on Microsoft Azure Cloud and in containers, and in a way that I guess provides more protection against the local client. I think we're still yet to see exactly how much this is going to improve that ecosystem. But I think you can see kind of how the stars are aligning here. The release of Python support, discontinue of Visual Basic support in Excel, I think is the right move. But I think that there's still probably several years of pain for users that will struggle to move off that technology.
Yeah, and that's definitely echoed by Richard Rushing again in our chat, saying for many IT scripts and products that rely on them to work, like some NAC solutions, this is going to hurt a lot of orgs. And this is always the classic Microsoft decision, right? It's like companies build stuff off Microsoft stuff because it's standard, it's stable, they have extensive legacy support for everything. And then like, let's build all of our web apps off of Internet Explorer's bizarre standards. And then it turns out, oh, when there are security implications to that, then Microsoft stuff's holding the bag and trying to, patch stuff up. So I do, as the holder of all things legacy, I always feel like Microsoft has to weigh that balance ever so carefully. And as CCL points out, I wouldn't be surprised if MS delays the kill further because of the issues for a lot of orgs. We shall see. Cybersecurity Headlines will let you know if, in fact, they do. Thanks to everybody that contributed in our chat. CCL, Richard Rushing. We saw James Driscoll. We saw David Spark in there. Hey, Mr. David Spark. Nice to see you in there. Everybody contributing, having some fun times, good stuff. Martin, before we get out of here, was there any story for you that was a thumbs up or an eye roller? Just something you reacted strongly to today in today's rundown?
I have one of each, if I may. I think the thumbs up was the rapid reset vulnerability. I think we're going to see more here, and it's good to pay attention to this and kind of stay on top of this. The one that was probably less impressed with was the call vulnerability. I think you probably got that from my description. Just caused a lot of attention that wasn't really warranted from my perspective. So one of each.
All right. Well, Martin Choluj, the VP of Security at ClickHouse, thank you so much for being on the show. Really appreciate it. Bringing a lot of expertise, just like helping me think differently about the news is always what I appreciate on the show. Where can people find you online if they want to follow you and see what you're up to?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, and thank you so much for having me on the show. It was great to be able to contribute to it.
Absolutely. We'll have to have you on again, and we'll have that link to your LinkedIn in the show notes. Thanks also today to our sponsor, Hyperproof. Know your risks, monitor your risks, mitigate your risks. Also, thank you again to all of our commenters. And remember, if you listen to this later, you can join us on our live stream every single Friday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. We're running down the news. It's a fun time. We'd love to have you here. We'll be back next week, like I said, with another Week in Review show. And you can still get your daily news fix through, you guessed it, Cybersecurity Headlines. I get a free sandwich if I plug it 6 times every single day. Give us about 6 minutes. We'll get you all caught up. Until the next time we meet, I'm Rich Stroffolino, reminding you to have a super sparkly day.
Cybersecurity Headlines are available every weekday. Head to CISOSeries.com for the full stories behind the headlines.